It was a warm July evening in 1995 when Miriam, aged 17, and her younger sister Eliza, only 14, set out from their family's Amish farmhouse in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Their mother had carefully packed a small basket of freshly baked bread, pies, and preserves. Items the sisters were meant to deliver to a neighboring Amish settlement just a few miles away. With their horse, a gentle bay mare named Daisy, pulling the wagon, it seemed like the most ordinary of errands. For the Yoder family, this was routine, part of the quiet rhythm of Amish life. No one imagined that this short journey would turn into the community's darkest mystery. The girls left just before sunset, their wagon wheels creaking softly against the dirt road as fireflies began to flicker in the distance. Several neighbors saw them smiling and chatting as they passed, their plain bonnets tied neatly under their chins. Miriam held the reins with quiet confidence, while Eliza clutched the basket as though it were a treasure. Nothing seemed out of place, until hours later, when the sisters failed to return home. Their father lit a lantern and stood by the fence, scanning the darkened road for the familiar clop of Daisy's hooves. But the only sound was the night wind moving through the cornfields. As the hours dragged on, unease began to settle over the Yoder household. Their mother insisted perhaps the girls had stayed longer with relatives, but deep down, she knew that wasn't their way. The Amish live by strict order and punctuality, tasks are done without delay, and journeys are rarely made after nightfall. Soon, the family's older brothers set out on horseback, riding the roads the sisters would have taken. They returned with heavy faces and no sign of Miriam, Eliza, or the wagon. By midnight, the entire community was awake. Lanterns bobbed along dirt paths, and budgies were dispatched in all directions. Neighbors walked shoulder to shoulder across fields, searching for broken branches, wagon tracks, or dropped belongings. They combed the riverbanks, fearing the worst, that the horse and wagon had slipped into the current. But nothing was there. The road was silent, the fields untouched, as though the girls had never ridden through them at all. What disturbed the family most was the complete absence of any clue. A wagon leaves tracks, a horse makes noise. Even if they had been waylaid or suffered an accident, there should have been signs. Instead, the trail vanished into nothingness. To those who searched that night, it felt less like a disappearance, and more like the sisters had been swallowed whole by the land itself, leaving behind only questions that no one could yet answer. The morning after Miriam and Eliza vanished, the search became more organized. The sheriff's office, though small and unaccustomed to large investigations, responded quickly to the Yoder family's desperate pleas. Deputies rode out to the dirt roads leading away from the farm, marking the ground for wagon tracks. They examined every bend, every crossroads, hoping to find the slightest impression of Daisy's hooves. Yet by sunrise, the path that should have been clear was inexplicably absent, as though the wagon had never rolled forward from the Yoder farm at all. The Amish community, though wary of outside authorities, joined in with determination. Men hitched their own wagons, women carried lanterns, and children were told to stay close to home. For hours, they swept through farmlands and wooded trails. Dogs trained for tracking were brought in from a nearby town, their noses pressed low to the earth. At one point, the dogs picked up a faint scent near a narrow creek, and hope surged among the searchers. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the trail evaporated at the water's edge, as though the girls had stepped into the stream and vanished. As the hours passed, tension began to ripple through the search party. Some neighbors suggested they had run away, but the Amish knew better. Miriam and Eliza were deeply rooted in their family and faith, the kind of girls who obeyed every rule of their community. Others speculated that outsiders, unfamiliar with Amish customs, might have lured or forced the sisters away. The Amish, who rarely interacted with the outside world, began to look with suspicion at passing automobiles and unfamiliar faces. The idea that someone had stalked the girls on their route weighed heavily on the hearts of parents, who now watched their children with fresh fear. By the second night, desperation began to outweigh order. Men climbed into the dense woods with rifles slung across their backs, while others waded knee-deep into swamps and ponds, feeling along the muddy bottoms for any sign of the wagon. Families prayed aloud as they searched, their words echoing through the trees, mixing with the cries of Daisy's name, as though calling for the horse might somehow lead them to the sisters. Each hour that passed seemed to drain the hope from the group, leaving behind only the gnawing dread that something unnatural had occurred. What haunted the community most was not just the absence of the girls, but the silence that surrounded their disappearance. There had been no screams, no overturned soil, no broken branches, nothing to suggest a struggle. Amish families, who were used to every sound of the countryside, could not comprehend how two sisters, a wagon, and a horse could simply cease to exist between one settlement and the next. The initial search, meant to bring answers, only deepened the riddle, leaving everyone with a chilling realization: the Yoder sisters had vanished into thin air, and no one could explain how. In the weeks following the disappearance, when the official search had begun to lose momentum, strange reports started trickling into the sheriff's office. A fisherman on the Susquehanna River claimed that just after dawn, he saw two young girls walking along the misty shoreline. They wore plain dresses and white bonnets, their heads bowed as if in silence. When he called out to them, they didn't respond. Instead, they walked slowly into a patch of fog, and were gone by the time he reached the spot. He later swore the younger one carried a wicker basket, just like the one the sisters had taken on their delivery. Not long after, a farmer traveling home at night described hearing the sound of wagon wheels clattering on the old quarry road. He found it odd. Amish wagons usually carried lanterns for safety, yet this one had none. In the faint moonlight, he saw the outline of a small buggy moving far ahead. He urged his horse forward, trying to catch up, but the sound abruptly stopped near the bend by the quarry. When he reached the curve, the road was empty, the dust settled, and there was no sign of wheels or hoofprints. The image of that lanternless wagon haunted him for years. Others in the community began whispering of ghostly sounds. Children claimed they heard laughter in the cornfields, soft and distant, that faded when adults drew near. A traveling merchant, unfamiliar with Amish ways, told locals that he had passed two young girls in plain dresses on the side of the road. He said they stared at him without a word, their eyes strangely vacant, before stepping back into the tree line. When he tried to show authorities the exact spot, no tracks or clothing fibers were found. His story was dismissed. But it spread quickly among neighbors who already feared something otherworldly. The more stories emerged, the more divided the community became. Some believed the sightings were genuine, perhaps proof that Miriam and Eliza were alive, but being held somewhere against their will. Others argued that fear and grief had made people imagine things, seeing shapes in the mist, hearing echoes in the woods, creating hope where none existed. But among the Amish, who lived quietly and without embellishment, these stories carried a weight that outsiders didn't easily dismiss. To them, too many details aligned: the wagon, the basket, the dresses, for it all to be mere coincidence. Still, with every new account, the sheriff's men found nothing concrete. No wagon tracks on the quarry road, no footprints along the riverbank, no discarded fabric in the cornfields. It was as if the sisters existed only as flickers in the corner of people's eyes, glimpses that appeared briefly before vanishing into the void. The sightings fueled the mystery, deepening the dread that whatever had taken Miriam and Eliza was still moving among the community, hidden, watching, and waiting. By the time 2 full years had passed since Miriam and Eliza's disappearance, the official investigation had slowed to a crawl. The sheriff's office had followed every tip, every strange sighting, every rumor of wagon wheels echoing in the night. Yet nothing ever connected back to the sisters in a way that could be proven. What began as a desperate manhunt turned into little more than a stack of dusty reports filed away in the county building. For the Yoder family, it felt as though the outside world had already moved on, while their own lives remained frozen on that July evening in 1995. One of the greatest challenges was the Amish community's own reluctance to cooperate fully with modern investigative methods. They did not allow photographs of their loved ones, leaving the authorities with nothing more than sketches to distribute. They resisted fingerprinting and other forensic tools that might have aided the search. While their faith guided these choices, it also created gaps in the investigation that could never be filled. Without concrete evidence, the case files grew thinner, and eventually, the sheriff admitted quietly to the family that they had no new leads to pursue. The absence of answers weighed heavily on the Amish settlement. Families who once left their doors unlocked began bearing them at night. Parents escorted their children everywhere, afraid that the same fate might befall them. Community gatherings often ended in silence, broken only by whispered speculation. Was it outsiders who had taken Miriam and Eliza, or was the truth buried somewhere closer to home? Some feared speaking their suspicions aloud, worried it might fracture the tightly knit community, but the doubt hung over them like a storm cloud. As the years ticked on, the missing sisters became almost like shadows in the town's history. Their names were spoken less often in public, though never forgotten in private prayers. Some families hung on to the belief that the girls were still alive somewhere, perhaps living in secret, forced into a world far removed from the one they had known. Others resigned themselves to darker possibilities, but with no bodies, no wagon, and no trace of Daisy the horse, there was nothing tangible to mourn. Only questions, and a gnawing emptiness that time could not erase. By 1999, 4 years after the disappearance, the case was labeled cold. The sheriff locked the remaining files into a steel cabinet and shifted focus to more immediate crimes. Yet for the Yoder family, each passing day was a fresh wound. Every sound of wagon wheels rolling down the road made their mother rush to the window, only to find it was someone else's buggy. Every creak of the barn door made their father rise at night, lantern in hand, hoping against reason that Daisy had somehow found her way home. But night after night, year after year, there was nothing but silence, and the mystery of the vanished sisters only deepened. In the autumn of 2004, nearly a decade after Miriam and Eliza vanished, a group of young urban explorers stumbled into something no one had expected. They had been venturing through the thick Appalachian hills, documenting old rail tunnels and forgotten mines for thrill and curiosity. Most of the mines were collapsed or sealed, but one yawning mouth of darkness remained open, its wooden beams rotting, its interior cold as stone. Drawn by the mystery, the group pushed inside with flashlights, their beams cutting through clouds of dust. What they discovered buried in the shadows would reignite a mystery that many in Lancaster County had tried to let rest. Not far from the entrance, beneath a slope of loose earth and broken timbers, the explorers uncovered the decayed remains of a wagon. Its wooden frame was splintered, its once polished sides caked with years of dirt and soot. The wheels had collapsed, twisted into unnatural angles as if crushed under weight or forced into the mine. One of the explorers brushed away the grime with his sleeve and froze. Etched faintly into the side panel were the initials, M.Y. and E.Y. Scratched by a hand into the wood, those letters instantly carried the legend of the Yoder sisters back from silence into grim reality. Beside the broken wagon, the earth yielded another grim discovery. The skeletal remains of a horse, collapsed in a heap, still bore traces of a leather bridle and rusted metal bit. The explorers described how the skull lay at an angle, as though the animal had fallen suddenly, pulling the wagon into darkness. The air in the mine was damp and still, and the faint sound of water dripping echoed like whispers in the black. For a moment, the group thought they heard something else. Shuffling, faint movement deeper in the tunnels. But when they called out, only silence answered back. The sheriff's department was alerted immediately, and within days the site was sealed off for investigation. Crime scene tape stretched across the mine entrance. Lanterns and heavy lights were brought in, and officials descended into the cavern that had hidden its secret for 9 long years. Along with the wagon and horse remains, investigators uncovered scraps of cloth wedged in the rocks, fragments of fabric that appeared to be plain, homespun material, bonnet ties and the hem of a dress. Some pieces still clung to faint traces of stitching that matched Amish clothing. The sheriff would later remark that it was as though the mine itself had been keeping the memory of the sisters locked away, but the most disturbing detail wasn't the wagon or the cloth. It was the location itself. The mine sat miles off the girls' original route, in a part of the hills they should never have reached by accident. There were no wagon tracks leading in, no signs of forced entry at the mine's mouth. How the wagon and Daisy ended up inside remained unexplained. Some whispered that the horse had been led there deliberately. Others murmured that the sisters had been taken there against their will. But the mine, with its yawning black tunnels stretching endlessly into the earth, refused to give up more than fragments, leaving investigators with only fear, speculation, and the grim certainty that the Yoder mystery was far from over. When investigators ventured deeper into the mine after the Wagons' discovery, the atmosphere grew heavier with every step. The air was damp and stale, carrying the metallic tang of rust, and something far older. An earthy, almost suffocating smell that clung to their throats. Their flashlights caught faint shapes etched into the walls, at first dismissed as cracks in the stone. But as the beams steadied, the carvings became undeniable, deliberate markings, hand-scratched symbols gouged into the rock as though left behind by desperate hands. Some were crude crosses, others indecipherable shapes, all clustered around the area where the wagon had rested. Closer inspection revealed something even more unsettling. Along one of the walls were vertical lines, dozens of them, like tally marks scratched in uneven strokes. They climbed upward, scattered and frantic, as though someone had been keeping track of time in the suffocating dark. The longer investigators stared at them, the more disturbing the patterns became. Were these days counted in isolation? Weeks, or a desperate attempt to cling to reality in the shadows of the mine? Near the base of the tally marks, written faintly, were 3 chilling words etched shakily into the stone. TYDOATH18HT. These words sent shivers through the sheriff and his deputies. The implication was terrifying. Someone, or something, had been there with the sisters. But no other evidence of human presence could be found. No lantern remnants, no food scraps, no tools. Only the broken wagon, the skeletal horse, and those haunting scratches. the absence of any clear human trail made the words on the walls all the more disturbing. If Miriam and Eliza had written them, who were they? And if someone else had written them, why had the message been left to linger for nearly a decade in silence? As investigators pressed deeper into the tunnels, their flashlights revealed more fragments of cloth wedged between stones, as though torn away in a struggle or in flight. Some of the fabric scraps were damp, hardened by years of moisture, yet still faintly carried the texture of bonnets and Amish dresses. A shoe, its leather cracked and falling apart, was also discovered deeper in the mine, half buried in the silt. It was small, the kind a teenage girl might have worn. The shoe was carefully bagged and sent for analysis, but by then, 9 years of rot and erosion had erased anything that could definitively link it to the sisters. What unsettled the search teams most was the sheer depth of the mine. The tunnels twisted like veins, splitting off into chambers that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. Even after weeks of exploration, entire sections remained uncharted. Rumors began to spread among deputies that strange echoes followed them. Footsteps where none should be, whispers that carried farther than voices ought to. Whether it was imagination or something more, no one could deny the chilling feeling that lingered in the air, that the mine was more than a grave for a wagon. It was a place that had witnessed something unspeakable, and it was not ready to give up its secrets. Despite weeks of combing through the mine, investigators could not recover the sisters' remains. The wagon was there, the horse was there, scraps of clothing and a lone shoe were there. But Miriam and Eliza themselves had vanished into the tunnels, just as completely as they had vanished from the road 9 years earlier. Some officers argued the sisters had perished deep inside the mine, and that their bodies were simply unrecoverable, hidden in the twisting labyrinth of collapsed chambers. But others weren't convinced. To them, the carvings on the walls and the strange absence of bones suggested something more sinister, something that had not yet come to light. The Yoder family struggled to make sense of the discovery. For the parents, the wagon was both proof and torment. Proof that the girls had indeed traveled far from home, but torment in that it offered no closure, only deeper uncertainty. Every fabric scrap, every tally mark, every carved cross became an object of painful speculation. Had their daughters suffered here in silence? Had someone else brought the wagon into the mine as part of a cruel game? No one could provide answers, and so the Yoder family remained suspended between hope and despair, unable to bury what had not been found. The community, too, was shaken by the revelation. For years, some had believed the sisters were alive somewhere, hidden away in a world beyond the Amish fields. Others had whispered of darker forces, of evil that stalked the quiet roads at night. The mine discovery breathed new life into those fears. Families who had long stopped speaking of the disappearance found themselves whispering again after dusk, their lanterns glowing in tightly shuttered homes. The tale of the sisters was no longer a fading memory. It had returned like a wound torn open, raw and unresolved. Rumors began to twist in all directions. Some believed the wagon's presence in the mine was staged, placed there deliberately to reignite fear, or to mislead investigators. Others wondered whether the tally marks were not from the sisters at all, but from someone else who had once been trapped in those tunnels. THYWTCH18GHT fueled endless speculation. Who were they? Were the sisters being watched by a person, or did it mean something far more unexplainable? The mine's silence offered no reply, and that silence was perhaps the most haunting answer of all. As time passed, the case slid once more into limbo. The sheriff's files grew thicker with speculation but thinner with facts. Families kept their children closer. Strangers in town were met with suspicion, and in the hills of Appalachia, the mine remained sealed but not forgotten. A place where a wagon, a horse, and fragments of Amish cloth still lay in the dark, bearing silent witness to a mystery that refused to rest. Miriam and Eliza Yoder had vanished in 1995, and even with the mine's discovery 9 years later, the final chapter of their story remained unwritten, leaving only questions that no one dared to answer aloud. And so, nearly 3 decades later, the mystery of Miriam and Eliza Yoder remains unsolved. Their wagon was found, their horse was found, even their clothing left behind like echoes of their presence. But the sisters themselves were never seen again. The abandoned mine gave us fragments of their final journey, but not the truth of what happened in those shadows. Were they led there by someone they trusted? Did they stumble into darkness on their own? Or is there something far older, far darker, that claimed them in those hills? To this day, their names linger like a ghost story, whispered around lantern light, a reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. The mine stands silent, but the questions it holds may never stop echoing. Perhaps the most haunting thought of all is this: if the sisters truly carved those words into the stone, T-way teach NHT. Then who, or what, were they warning us about?
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.